Some of you have been in the class before, last year or even years before, or for others, it looks like it's your first class session. Welcome. This is part of our 3-year program on Introduction to Secular Humanistic Judaism. So last year we did Jewish history from murky beginnings to murky future and everything we know in between. This year we'll be doing Jewish culture, everything from the big events like holidays and life cycle ceremonies to music, art, literature, lifestyle, diet, clothing, all those pieces that make up culture. The 3rd year of the class is on philosophy and the intellectual roots of secular and humanistic Judaism. So we'll be running that one next year in 2003 to 2004, or 23 to 24. Believe it or not, we're already in the middle of the 2020s. Our schedule for this class, I'll share that on the screen, was also distributed in our Shofar newsletter and at High Holidays as a flyer. These will always be online and in person. We do have a couple of people joining us in the room. And we are always happy to have people participate either way. This has the class schedule with a list of all the topics that we'll be covering. One thing you'll notice when you do get into the course packet, it's organized slightly differently because we have a little bit more time in this than we had in the course was designed for 15 sessions, but we have more than 15 sessions over the course of a congregational year. So I was able to split up High Holidays as one session and Passover as another session, instead of trying to cram them all together as all the major holidays in one unit, which is what the curriculum is designed to do. So that gives us a little bit more time to go in a bit more depth. Same thing with the life cycle events. We have a separate session each for birth, bar, bat mitzvah, weddings, and funerals, as opposed to having them combined in sessions. But all these dates will be on the Kol Hadash calendar online, which you can subscribe to if you just want them to show up in your Gmail calendar or other calendar you use, or you can always get the flyer, and I'll put that in the shared online folder that will be distributed as well. And the way our sessions generally work is I generally have an opening presentation on the topic at hand, and then we will open up for general comments, reactions, questions, and then we have a series of discussion questions. But for each unit in the packet, as you'll see, there is a introductory essay that sort of outlines where we're coming from. And then we also have the discussion questions that appear afterwards that we'll go through. Some of them are simply recalling what we talked about before. In other cases, they are going into more depth on some of the issues that are raised by the course materials. But I thought to start, it'd be good to at least introduce ourselves a little bit. And I thought for this topic, it might be nice to share 2 things. One is your name, and the second is what is your best memory of some connection with Jewish culture? And there are people who are participating in the class who themselves don't identify as Jewish, but they might also have some connection or memory of some experience of Jewish culture in some way. I mean, it could be seeing Fiddler on the Roof, but it doesn't matter. The point is that whatever that experience was, it's part of the class to explore the manifold ways to experience Jewish culture. So I'll start. My name is Adam Shalom. I live in Highland Park, but I'm the rabbi at Kol Hadash and also the Dean for North America of the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism, which actually is the producer of this adult curriculum that we're using. Of course, it's written by Rabbi Adam Shalom, so I'm allowed to use it. The best Jewish memory I have that I draw on this wall quite a bit is I remember growing up, my family would always turn off all the lights in the house during Hanukkah time, so the only light burning in the room we were in would be the menorah, and we just had one for the family. And we would always bet on which candle would last the longest of those candles. It was not high stakes betting, but it was, for pride, but it was also to make it a little bit more entertaining. And it's a memory I have. I've continued with my kids as we've done it, even though we now each have our own menorahs, so we have more candles to choose from. But it's a positive Jewish memory for me. So maybe I'll ask our in-person participants first, and then we'll go around as I see you on the screen. If you can share your name and a little bit about you, and then more importantly, a positive Jewish memory.
Hey, I'm Roger Adelson. Sue and I live in Buffalo Grove, and I have an early experience. When I was growing up, my grandfather was from Glasgow, Scotland, and we used to go to my grandparents' house for Erev Rosh Hashanah, and hearing him recite prayers with a heavy Scottish brogue is a very pleasant memory.
Yeah, and I'm Susan, and it's really hard to think of one thing, but since Rabbi Adam had the list of everything we're covering in this course, and one of them was weddings, I guess my Jewish wedding would be my absolute favorite Jewish cultural experience.
Great, great. Susie Garfield, please.
Hi, I'm Susie Garfield. I'm a founding member of Kol Hadash. I live in Highland Park. It's really a challenge to select one memory, but I think my memory is a composite. It's my two sons' bar mitzvahs at Kol Hadash. My older son, Matt, was in the first bar mitzvah class. My younger son, Zach, was in the first class that Adam did the bar mitzvahs. And it's really significant because right before Matt was bar mitzvahed, the divorce to my non-Jewish ex-husband was in starting. And some of my family didn't recognize it until we addressed Matt separately at his bar mitzvah. And it's important because it confirmed to me that I was still parenting and I was still influencing the kids even through the trials. Neither of them practices or attend services now, but the experience to them is as indelible as it is to me. Thank you.
Sure. I actually remember something from Zach's bar mitzvah. We were rehearsing the week before, and he stumbled a little bit on the Hebrew, and someone offered him the usual consolation of, don't worry, no one will even know if you make a mistake because they don't know what it is anyways. But his response was really striking. He said, but I'll know. And I thought that was well internalized, a sense of pride and, in workmanship and wanting to do it well. And he did it very well. But I was really impressed by that response.
Actually, my kids, I've always said that Matt always knew how things should be. Zach always knew how he wanted things to be. So
Okay.
you picked up on that right away.
Great. Okay, next, how about Marjorie and Ed? Marjorie and Ed, are you there?
We are here. You want to go?
Yeah, I'm Ed Waxler, and this is Marjorie Roth, and we're new members of
Marjorie Leon.
Sorry, Marjorie Leon, and we're new members of Kol Hadash, and my favorite memories are associated with my family's Passover Seders, and I've been to a bunch of them, and I've always enjoyed them, and also latke making around Hanukkah time. So there's a lot of pleasant associations around family gatherings and meals.
Great.
And I'm Marjorie Leon, and I would say my favorite Jewish cultural memories have to do with Jewish music. I used to be the music counselor for Jewish day camps, and I used to be the music director for a religious school. I am not a formally trained music director for a religious school. I want to point that out. I was in my college years. They needed somebody, so I went and I filled in for them. So I have always enjoyed Jewish music. I've always enjoyed Jewish dance, and still do.
Great. We had a note in the chat. We have Sebak George from Romania. He's the vice president of the Jewish community, where he is, and it's great to have him with us. Maybe Cindy, would you be willing to share something?
Sure. I'm I'm Sydney. I'm a fairly new member. I've been around for not quite 2 years, but a member for about a year. And I discovered my Jewishness, my Jewish identity, when we learned that my mom was adopted by her dad, and kind of exploring that. And so in adulthood, I started kind of getting into more of that side of my history. And Hanukkah was kind of the first thing that I made mine. And when I sought out my my menorah, I looked forever to find just the right one that I wanted, and I got it. I used it the first year. I was so excited. Last fall, my husband and I moved, and when we moved, I made sure I put it in a really certain spot so that I would find it right away when we got to the new house. And then it didn't show up for months. And turns out it was in a box labeled stuffed animals and candles. But so I was kind of scrambling a little bit, and I was really frustrated. And my first 2 nights of Hanukkah were leftover wedding candles stuck into wine glasses because we had just moved and it's what I could find. But a friend of mine actually drove from the north side of Chicago out to where I live in Elgin and brought me one of her extra menorahs and some extra candles that she had. And that was really meaningful to me, that, you know, we aren't especially great or you know, close friends, but she did that just as, you know, a friendly, supportive gesture. And that really meant a lot. So
Nice, very nice.
I found my menorah in like February this year, so I'm looking forward to using it again.
Great. Anyone else want to share who I haven't called on yet? Feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. We've got Mark, we've got Dawn Ann, we've got Jack. I'm not going to call on you, but you're welcome to, and Steve Dorfman also, if you want to jump in. That's probably Sandy Dorfman, if I think.
Rabbi Shlomo.
Yeah, Jack, please.
I'm a friend of Bill Grolnick's, and he gave me your schedule. And you spoke at our group a while back.
Mm-hmm.
And I attended a class with you a few years back. And when I reported back to my wife that there really wasn't enough oil the last 8 days and a few other things that you told me about, she never really wanted me to see you again. But you're bringing back in the discussion, people are mentioning a couple things. I grew up at Bethel. My parents were very, very close with the Weisbergs at Bethel. And I was in the first confirmation class on the in the synagogue on Tui. My daughter was in the last one, and my son was in the first one in Northbrook. And he married my wife and me, and my brother and his wife, and my son and his wife. So we had that relationship. Now we're at Macomb Solel Lakeside. But the discussion about the Hanukkah thing is, I have 2 grandchildren, and I've made menorahs for them. And so Hanukkah now, without the oil story, I'm very comfortable, and I enjoy watching them use my menorahs. Thank you.
Very good, very good. Should have said spoiler alert on that one. We'll get to Hanukkah as we go along. What is culture? If we're studying Jewish culture, we have to get some sense of what culture is. And on some level, culture is, well, let's think about it more phenomenologically. It's human creation. It's things that people make for themselves. Now, that could be material, like technological culture, but it could also be artistic expression. You know, those early cave paintings, or something 40,000 years ago where they made a figure of a human body with a wolf's head on it as a statue, and it was made out of, I think, a tusk from some animal. It's something that never existed in the real world. It was created by human imagination. And so whether it's depicting art on the wall or even that brilliant artist who put their hand on the wall in Lascaux 25,000 years ago and blew some paint on it and left a handprint on the wall so we knew that one person was there at one time. And some scholars speculate that it was a woman that did it actually because of the shape of the hand and the fingers, and this is beyond my skill. But in any case, the point is that it's made by people, and it is expressing something about the human condition and the human experience. Culture transcends biology. It transcends the individual experience. I mean, what I do in my lifetime is not culture in the same sense that writing a book that then gets read again and again, even after I'm gone, or a piece of art that lasts, or sculpture, or architecture. It's beyond one individual's lifespan or one individual's experience. It's sort of a collective project. I mean, I could have Adam's culture that's, you know, I don't know what kind of candy I like and, you know, what kind of TV shows I watch. That's particular to me. But culture is a broader phenomenon that appeals to broader groups. It could be a very small social group, the culture of a neighborhood, or it could be the culture of a people, or even of a nation, or human culture as a whole. And in some ways, culture is a way of expressing something about a particular group's experiences or approach to life, where they find meaning and what meaning they find in particular moments of life, how they express beauty and what they define as beautiful, which may be different from culture to culture. You know, one example, people think of music as a universal, but then you play for them Asian style music, which is very different tonality and different notation and a different conventions. And they say that's noise. And then you play for them AC/DC, and they might say that's also noise. I'm thinking of Mozart, I'm thinking of Beethoven, that's universal music, but there is no universal music. There's music of particular cultures, but each culture defines a beautiful and a not beautiful, and they may cross lines. And sometimes we get beyond our own sense of beautiful to find it elsewhere. I have no reason for having this particular affinity, but I love bagpipe music. There is nothing in my cultural or historical background that connects me with Scotland in any way that I've ever found. But there's something about the drone and the wheeze and adding the snare drums to it. I just love the way bagpipe music sounds, and it's a particular affinity for me. So, you know, my sense of beauty is also individual. It's not only defined by culture, but I have some conventions that were pounded into me before I was paying attention. By the way, culture also includes having fun. Sports, games, amusements. It's not only highfalutin expressing of deep philosophical ideas. Sometimes it's pastimes, you know, that are there to entertain, not just to express. One other example is that many cultural conventions define what is good and what is bad. This is, you know, expressions of values, philosophy, etc., but also expressions of purity or impurity, holiness or profanity, or the ordinary. You know, it's sometimes described as separating the holy from the profane, but profane in that sense really just means ordinary. So you have special and you have ordinary, and then you might have transgressive, heretical as a third category. This is the old joke about the man who is checking through customs, and he has 5 sets of dentures in his luggage. And the customs officer asks him, well, why do you have 5 sets of dentures? And he says, well, I have my milk dentures and I have my meat dentures for everyday eating because I'm following kosher laws. Okay, well then why the other 3? Well, I have my kosher for Passover milk dentures and my kosher for Passover meat dentures. Well then what is the 5th one? Oh, those are my treif dentures. That's for my not kosher food that I want. When I want to have bacon or pork, I can use those dentures instead. You know, this is how people inherit culture, adopted for their own usage. Sometimes it's inconsistent philosophically, but it doesn't matter. So these are, you know, ways of expressing value can be affirmative or negative or even defining the transgressive. But in a modern liberal society, those categories are a lot more flexible than they might have been 100 or 150 years ago, or in more insular communities even today. So when we talk about Jewish culture, we are going to talk about historic Jewish culture and traditional Jewish culture as practiced by the most traditional, but we're also going to be open to how liberal Jews choose, adapt, adopt, and transform their inheritance in their own unique ways. So as one example, I just met with a wedding couple tonight, and one thing I always ask wedding couples today is, do you want to break a glass at the end of the wedding? Because it's not assumed that they will. And do both the groom and the bride want to break a glass? Because why should we assume that only the groom breaks the glass? When we have gender equality and values in every other walk of life, why not? And sometimes it's in fact the bride who wants to break the glass. I had one case where the groom was not Jewish, the bride was, and she said, I'm going to break the glass because I'm good at breaking things and I can finally put it to productive use at this point in the ceremony. So, we inherit it and then we can adapt and adopt and change as we go forward. So if we think about examples of human culture, and specifically American culture, we can find parallels for Jewish culture in those as well. So what might be some examples of American culture? And you can type it in the chat if you'd like, or if you want to just unmute and say it out loud. What would be like a discrete example? Don't give me 6. Give me one discrete example of what would count as American culture. Hamburgers, okay. So you might have food that could be just generic staple food, or it could be special event food. There's National Hamburger Day or National Cheeseburger Day, I think was recently. And or people might have hamburgers when they go to the baseball game, or hamburgers for July 4th, so you have food assigned for a specific time. Obviously in Jewish life, we have staple foods, we have special holiday foods. And of course, they're different by different geographies, because how you make a hamburger in Texas might be different from how you make a veggie burger in Seattle. And same is true in Jewish culture as well. In the chat box, we have Sunday night football. There's a leisure activity on a specific time that used to command large amounts of eyeballs, right? And we just got through our high holiday season, which was sort of like the Super Bowl of rabbinic life. But that used to command a lot more attention than it does today, because fewer and fewer American Jews are participating even in high holiday services. The two major events that get the most Jewish attendance are Passover and Hanukkah. And I'll talk about why those have become the major, and I've even had people say to me today, we always celebrate the high holidays, Passover and Hanukkah, because they think of those as the major events, because that's the one everyone does. 70% plus of American Jews light Hanukkah candles, at least some, and do some kind of Passover Seder. They may not keep the dietary laws, but they do a Seder. And high holiday services is much further down. Shabbat services is way further down on that list. And that's because people are making their own choices about what special events to watch. And I've noticed the ratings are going down on Monday Night Football, on Sunday Night Football too. So this is a function of many choices, many eyeballs. Other examples, I see Susie has her hand raised. Susie, can you jump in and I'll look through the chat?
Thanksgiving.
Okay, Thanksgiving, right? It's a good parallel to a lot of Jewish events that are at home with special meals and food, or special rituals. Maybe some families have Thanksgiving events. I'm good with Thanksgiving church service. That's part of what they do. Someone mentioned going to Erev Rosh Hashanah dinner at a family's house. And there are many families for whom the dinner on Rosh Hashanah is more important than services. I've mentioned before, when I was in Michigan, when I'm first married to my wife, her grandmother never understood why we couldn't be at their house for Rosh Hashanah dinner, because that was the important part of the holiday. And we tried to explain to her that I was a rabbi, I had to be at services, I couldn't go to the dinner, and the dinner was in Windsor, Ontario, which was an hour away from where the services were in suburban Detroit. But she couldn't understand, why can't you just come for Rosh Hashanah dinner? That's the big event. But for some people, it is the home event that's more important than the public program. So people might not watch the Thanksgiving Day parade, they might not watch any football games, but the family dinner becomes a very important staple for them. Cindy commented clothing. Americans are often very identifiable with jeans and gym shoes or sports jerseys. In fact, you can often pick the American walking around in Europe because they have tennis shoes on and not sandals, which is a more European style of footwear. So again, Jews have traditional clothing sometimes for special events, sometimes for everyday use. Certainly the Hasidic ultra-Orthodox Jews have their uniform for men and limits for women on what they're allowed to wear, how much elbow they can show or not, and so on, as other cultures do as well. Okay, so these are all examples of the kind of cultural pieces that we're going to be exploring in this class. As I mentioned, we'll be talking about everything from high culture to low culture. So I'm actually going to pull up an outline of the class so we can see what we're going to be talking about here. Okay, this will be in the folder as well. So we have a series of sessions on a number of topics. So we start with our holidays, the high holidays, and then the major festivals, which include Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot. This is on page I of the beginning of the introduction if you're looking on paper. Then we have our minor holidays like Purim or Shvat, which come through the winter, or the fast days, which are observed by small numbers of Jews. And we also have modern Jewish holidays, Israeli Independence Day, the Holocaust Memorial Day. These are obviously more recent innovations that have found purchase with Jews outside of Israel, not just in Israel proper, even though it was Israel that set the dates for those holidays. We move into life cycle events. Birth as a arrival of a new life, bar or bat mitzvah, sometimes called b mitzvah today to be gender neutral, as a coming of age ceremony. We'll look at life cycle events like marriage, forming new families, and death, which is also part of the life cycle. As we heard, it's one of the memorable experiences people have. And when we look at those events, we'll be asking, what's the human impulse to celebrate these things? Why do people mark coming of age? Why do people in general mark new partnerships or mark a death? And we'll see that Jews are people too. You know, we're trying to meet those human needs in our own vocabulary, in our own cultural resonance, but there will be some features that are universal. And that's part of our approach to these ceremonies. We'll also look at literature. Jewish culture historically has been a very word-focused culture, and not as many Jewish athletes, but certainly a lot of Jewish writers. And so we'll look at the earliest books that we have extant, the books of the Torah, the first 5 books, and then the rest of the Hebrew Bible. We'll also look at rabbinic literature as expressed in law, in the Mishnah and Talmud, in legend, in Midrash, and then also in liturgy, in the prayer book and major prayers. That's a kind of culture too. You know, one of the innovations that we have is that, and I'll talk about it more in a little bit, but for us, religion is included in culture. It doesn't define the limits of it, but it counts as part of culture. And that way, it's also our inheritance that we can adapt and change. It wasn't given on Mount Sinai. And then we'll look a little bit at modern Jewish literature as well. We have those breakdown of those specific topics, and then we get into other style of culture, music, lifestyle, and diet. You know, people sometimes talk about high culture and low culture, but we have to remember that most Jews are participating in what we would call low culture of what you eat and what you wear and how you wear your hairstyle and what kind of professions you pursue and how you earn a living. That's everyday life. And by the way, if you're looking back historically and you want to hear women's voices and describe women's experience, often you have to look at that kind of social history because they weren't leading armies and serving in government because that wasn't encouraged in those days in most cases. There were exceptions, but by and large, that was the province of men. So if you want women's history and cultural experience, you need to look to music, art, lifestyle, diet, those kind of questions, and especially the question of language. You know, it's very hard to experience a culture without knowing the language. There's something about going to places where you can speak the language that gives you an in to understanding what you're experiencing. So we will talk a little bit about Jewish language. You're not going to come out fluent in Yiddish or Hebrew from one session on Jewish language, but at least to get a flavor of what the languages are like and why they're important to understanding culture. In particular, when we talked about gender, in Eastern Europe, there was a very interesting phenomenon that Yiddish was referred to in Yiddish as Mama Loshen, which means mother's language, mother tongue. It's what you spoke at home. It was the language of women. And Hebrew was the Loshen Kodesh, the holy language, which was the language of prayer, of religious law, of synagogue practice, and it was generally the province of men. There was even a famous collection of translations of the Bible into Yiddish, and in the frontispiece of the book, it said that this book is for women and for men who are like women, which means real men read Hebrew. But if they can only read Yiddish, then they should read this book. So language, again, is one of those places where gender makes its appearance. And then we'll also look at the varieties of Jewish culture, because after all, Jewish culture is not only Eastern European Ashkenazi Jewish culture. It's not only bagels and lakshan and brisket. I mean, there's plenty of other pieces of Jewish culture from the Middle East, from the Mediterranean, from Central Asia, from India, China, and these are all expressions of the Jewish cultural experience. We don't want to be parochial, or as they say now, Ashkenormative, So if, we're only focused on Ashkenazi style. We want to be more broad in our perspective on Jewish culture. So this will be how we explore the major areas of Jewish cultural experience. But there's still one more question we should answer before we dive into that. And that is, why are we studying Jewish culture? In a choice of all the topics I could have chosen for this year's class, why focus on Jewish culture? Well, for secular and humanistic Jews in particular, Jewish culture is a way to connect to being Jewish that isn't defined by religion strictly. I mean, obviously religion has an impact on how you celebrate holidays, how you mark life cycle ceremonies, what kind of dietary laws you have. Religion is part of that. But studying about it, as opposed to what you're told to do, is a different phenomenon. And it also empowers you to make your own choices for how you're going to celebrate and express your own Jewish culture. The more you know, the more you can make choices. It's also in some ways a rebuttal to people who say, well, if you're not religious, what do? You just sit around eating bagels? No, we're going to study the history of these holidays and the history of these life cycle events and how Jews have created art over the centuries. And you're going to tell me that's not Jewish just because it isn't Torah, Torah, Torah over and over again? No, we can be much more creative and expansive in our understanding of what counts as studying and experiencing Jewish life. After all, you learn something by making a hamantash or making latkes that you don't get by reading about the laws of when to light the candles. Something different about that lived experience and the tastes and the memories. Listening and seeing can produce memories, but one of the strongest senses tied to memory is smell. And smell is not about learning facts. Smell is about experience and making something part of you by eating it. And our approach, as I said, is that culture includes religion, but it's not only defined by religion. So as an example, going to eat at a non-kosher deli could totally count as a Jewish cultural experience because they have traditionally Eastern European Jewish foods being served. If they serve bacon there too, who cares? It doesn't make it not Jewish just because it's not kosher. I'll even point out that there is one time of year where a foreign food has become Jewish food, and that is on Christmas Day, when Jews go to eat Chinese food. Now, it was because that was what was open on Christmas, but there's now this cliche that Jews go to the movies and eat Chinese food. So Chinese food on Christmas has become a Jewish ritual. And I'll bet you almost all those Chinese restaurants were not kosher back in the day. There are some kosher Chinese restaurants now for a niche market, but by and large it wasn't, and it didn't matter. It became a Jewish ritual to have that on that day. And as we also touched on, this culture can be episodic or it can be daily. Dietary laws are every day. Lighting Shabbat candles are every week. Maybe that's why most Jews don't do those things, because it controls their life. But having latkes on Hanukkah, having matzah on Passover, that's once in a while. That I can do. And so episodic Jewish culture might be just as important to people as daily or lived experience every day kind of Jewish culture. If you're not speaking a Jewish language, it's a different experience. So Israelis who are speaking Hebrew every day and are cracking jokes using Talmudic references, and that can happen just because it's become part of the language. We quote the Bible and Shakespeare without even knowing it because it's become part of English language. Same is true for Hebrew in Israel. So they're having a Jewish cultural experience sometimes without even realizing it. A lot of the music there now has become pop music, but drawing on medieval Hebrew poetry, which is often religious, and even passages from the prayer book they bring into to quote and to reference in modern poetry and songs. So it's an interreligious dialogue because it's intertextual from ancient and modern sources in the language. We're doing in English here, it's going to be a different dynamic. So maybe the way we say it sounds Jewish. If I explain it like this, it sounds a bit like I'm teaching in a rabbinic seminary, because that's the sing-song style of rhetoric that they use there. Okay, so this is, again, culture coming out in many ways. It could be episodic, could be daily, could be special events only. So the last 2 points I want to make briefly, and then open up for comments, questions, reactions, is from our perspective, this is our bias in this class, we believe that Jewish culture evolved like any living thing. It was not created exactly as it started. There are people who imagine that Moses had a bar mitzvah and that there were ice sculptures. That it had to be exactly the same way all the way through. In the ultra-Orthodox world, they imagine that Moses and David and Abraham wore exactly what they wear now. They even discuss how Abraham ate matzah on Passover. Now, if you know the chronology of the Bible, that doesn't make any sense at all, because Abraham is way before the Exodus from Egypt when matzah starts. But if he was a good Jew and it was springtime, he didn't know why he was eating it, but he knew for 7 days he had to eat matzah. So this is the achronological, the anti-historical view of it. It's created in its essence, and it's carried through all the way exactly the same way, or almost exactly the same way. The core has been the same. But anybody who studies culture from a historical perspective knows it evolves and changes over time. I mean, even how we pronounce English has changed in America from the 19th century into this century. And it's sort of tough to reconstruct it sometimes. You have to read books that have, dialect written out as a way to try to reconstruct how they might have spoken, or getting early audio recordings of very old people and trying to understand how it was read that way. In any case, this is part of our challenge now as well. People think that Jewish culture has always been this way, but it's not true. And sometimes when you investigate, you poke a hole, like the story of the light on Hanukkah, or the story of the family that always cuts the ends off their brisket whenever they make it. And they decide to investigate, why do we do this? So no one remembers why we do this. So they go back to the oldest member of the family, and it turns out that originally the pan was too short. And so they had to cut off the ends of the brisket so it fit in the pan. And then even after they got a different pan, they had kept this tradition of cutting off the ends of the brisket, so they didn't bother changing it. And then they forgot what the meaning was of cutting off the end. So culture evolves sometimes for very practical reasons, and then we add resonance to it over time. So this is part of our process, is to treat culture as evolving, that the bar mitzvah was not always the way it is now. In fact, the idea of the 13-year-old giving a speech dates back to the 13th or 14th century in Poland. It was not universal. It wasn't universal in the Mizrahi or Middle Eastern Jewish world until the 20th century, where they sort of adopted it. They always had the category of bar mitzvah as a legal category. It's your age of responsibility. But in many Eastern Jewish communities in the Middle East, North Africa, they would allow the child to read from the Torah scroll before they were 13. If they were capable of doing it, there was no reason not to. But it was the Ashkenazi Jews who took it away from the 12-year-olds and limited it to the 13-year-olds, and then it became a big event when you finally got the chance to do it. So things change over time, and we can't always project back what is now to what was then. We want to understand how they evolve. And then the last piece is to understand that we're talking about this as Jewish culture. But maybe a better introduction, a better title to the class would be Introduction to Jewish Cultures, because they're diverse by ideology, by historical period, and by geographic distribution and the influence of outside cultures. The style of charoset, the special paste you eat on your matzah, is very different from Eastern European Jewish cuisine to Middle Eastern cuisine. Middle Eastern cuisine uses dates instead of apples. And again, for Ashkenazi Jews, what? No apples in the charoset? But for Middle Eastern Jews, what? Apples in the charoset? No, it should be dates. They have different cultural reference points. So when we talk about Jewish culture, we always have to think about Jewish cultures. There are commonalities and there are also boundaries and differences. And I think of it, to get back to the brainstorming at the beginning, like American culture. What's American food? Well, it could be hamburgers, it could be hot dogs, it could also be Creole cooking, that's American. Rice in the Low Country in South Carolina, that's American cooking. Pizza is an American invention, the way we're used to eating it. It's not the way they do it in Italy. Tex-Mex cuisine is American. What? Grits, another good example, sure. I mean, there's all kinds of American innovations in cuisine, and they don't have to be consistent, and they can be in a wide range, but they're in the family of American food. And so I would say the same as Jewish cultures. There's a family of Jewish cultures that count as Jewish culture writ large. And we're sort of exploring the diversity within that broad family.